So at the moment, we have our validation for our name. Our other options do not have any validation bound to them. We have our styled input fields, which we can then demonstrate if we select a few items and then unselect them, but we don't have our error messages complete like we do inside of our name field. So this lesson, we're going to add some ng containers with some error messages to our other form fields. Instead of just disabling this create button, we're going to leave it enabled. And then if the user comes on our page, clicks create, we're then going to show those error messages instead of having them to have to go through them all individually. So if they were going to fill something out and then missed a field, we can press create. It will then highlight which fields need filling in rather than just disabling the button altogether. So let's first go and add our error messages to our other elements. Now for our select, we're not going to need a minimum length. So what I'm going to do is then delete this and then just copy our container again so we have a new template, because we're mostly going to be dealing with this required. So after our ng model, we're going to use another template ref. We're going to say icon equals and then pass in the ng model. So then we get it exported, which then means we can change over our name to icon and then change our icon is required to a capital. Similarly, we're going to do the same with our input type of price. If we bump inside of our label, we can go to the end of our input. We can then export this as price equals that ng model again, change our names over to price, make things capitalized, and then we have our radio buttons. Now we talked about making these required. So what we're in fact going to do is instead of making them required, because it's going to be an optional choice, we're going to use the undefined value. So if the promo property is not present, we're then just going to leave it. We're also going to set this as the default selection. And the great thing with radios is once they have been selected, you cannot unselect them. So we're essentially going to remove our required, and then in subsequent videos, we're going to make sure that the value is then selected. Because to us, it doesn't really matter if that property exists or not. So with this in mind, let's jump down to our description. Underneath our text area, we can add our ng container, export our description equals, and then that ng model. Take our description text, change over our name to the description, change the description to descriptions required. So this then pretty much leaves us where we want to. If we then hit save, we can click, blur, see the error, click, blur, see the error, click, blur, click, blur. Of course, if we select one of these, it's not going to make any difference because we're going to handle our radios a bit differently. Now at the moment, you can see that our template form is adding an empty string. So what we're going to do is make use of this undefined property. As you can see when I select it, it just removes it. So we'll cover this in separate videos because it's interesting how these react when it comes to adding our data model inside of a service instead of just letting our ng model create it for us. So this is where we essentially want to be. We've got our name is required. If we say ABC, we then have our minimum length. All of our inputs are then working as we should expect. Of course, we then have this create button, which is still disabled. So if we jump down here, I know in the last lesson, we disabled this for the user, and I just wanted to show you that because it's a perfectly valid way to do things. However, for this create, I am making the conscious decision for us that we're in fact going to leave a field completely enabled. So that means in our handle submit, we could say else console.log, and we can say invalid. So let's save this out and see what we get. We can open up the DevTools console, jump down, press create, we see invalid. If we then go and add some data, we can say testing, select any of these icons, add a price, don't worry about selecting a promo. We can say something here, ... Jump down, press create, we then have this entire object. So this is then being logged out because the form is valid. So what about the use case? And this is the whole idea behind this video, is to one, add our validation messages for the rest of our inputs. And secondly, trigger those validation messages all at once if we then press submit. I'm pressing submit, but nothing's actually happening. And we can't obviously expect our users to open the DevTools console because that wouldn't be quite right. So what can we do? If we have a look at our form, which gets given to us in the form arguments, you can see it's of type ng form. Now an ng form, as we know, has a form property on it. If we then press dot, we're then talking to this form object. So don't worry that we're in a nested form, because this first form argument we can call whatever we like. So for argument's sake, this could be called x. Is x valid? Our form in its entirety. But then we start dealing with the controls, so we can start to talk to different properties. You can see that we have mark all as touched, pending, dirty, pristine, untouched, and lots more of these methods. So if we undo those changes, we're going to leave things as form. What we essentially want to do, and let's think about this before we go and implement this change, let's jump up to our template. Here we say, I want to show this if our name field is invalid. Now we know that by default, when we land on the page, we can inspect. You can see we have this ng invalid, so we know that on a page load, our field is invalid. And now it's been touched because I've inspected it. If we refresh, we can see ng invalid, but we also have untouched and pristine. So what we can do is basically mark it as touched. But instead of marking just the one input as touched, we can mark them all as touched. So we can say form dot, and we have these markers dirty, pending, pristine, touched. We could do markers touched, and this would do the form itself. But if we do all, it's then going to look at all of the controls that we have registered. And we register them automatically with that name attribute and then binding to our ng model. So now when we press save, we don't need the console up anymore. Our user can completely go and press this button, and you can see as soon as we hit create, we then get presented with all of the errors. So this is a super nice way that we can provide some immediate feedback to the user as soon as they then hit our form submit. We can then display the errors, they know what they need to fill in, and then they can go back and press create again. So that's it for this lesson, a nice, sweet and short one on this nice mark all as touched. And I would highly encourage you to have a look through these ng forms and just be a little bit curious. What's really nice is we have TypeScript. So we can command click on a type, this then takes us through, and we can essentially see the blueprint of the code that we are using. So we don't need to read the source code itself, but we can see all these properties, and the Angular team has commented them really nicely, and we start to get a picture of what's happening underneath. So that's it for this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. This is a nice feature that we can add. When we land on the page, we can hit create, show those messages to the user, and this enhances the user experience and makes our form journey a little bit nicer.